Good afternoon. This is CIVE 634, Surface Water Hydrology. Today is lecture 12-1, meaning 12-week first lecture. And the subject today is more on catchment routing. We covered time area method and the Clark unit hydrograph. So the subject today is cascade or linear reservoirs. So I am going to cover today G13, 16 I'm going to cover, and then 17, I'll finish there. So that would leave 18, 19, 20, and 21 for this Wednesday. So let me get started with cascade of linear reservoirs, G13. Okay, we'll get started here. So I'm looking at section 10.3 of our book. So it's a customary. I'm going to go over this section kind of slowly because you need to get the stuff. Obviously, the first time you're not going to get it. You have to go over it a couple more times. There's a lot of very complex stuff in here. It's all discrete, meaning it's not analytic, but there's a lot of ins and outs to this type of calculation. First of all, the cascade of linear reservoirs, a little bit of the history of it. It was developed by gentlemen whom name I don't remember right now. Don Newton? Yeah, I think so. He was working with the Army Corps of Engineers in the Portland district back in the 40s and 50s.
Professor Ponce?
Yes?
Oh, sorry, this is Sarah McGaugh.
Okay,
I just wanted to let you know I'm here. And then I think also Joaquin said he's here too.
Yeah, I know. I'm only missing Axel. Is Axel there? No. Okay. So let's go back to the history of this. This is interesting. History is always important. I love history, actually. So I believe this guy, Don Newton, I think was his name, was working for the Army Corps in the 40s and 50s. And they, of course, the Army Corps was building all the dams in the Columbia, which started around, in earnest, around 1920. There's a lot of dams out there in the Columbia. And the Army, since that's a large river, it's a navigable river, the Army Corps was the usual agency to take charge. So he was working for the Army Corps at the Portland district, or in the Portland district, and he developed this methodology, which he called SAR, that stands, it's SSARR, stands for stream flow synthesis and reservoir regulation, because they were going to do that. They were going to put all these dams on the Columbia River, and they were going to regulate the flow, and they were going to synthesize stream flow, meaning they're going to do catchment routing, catchment, channel, and reservoir routing, all the routings, and they're going to be synthesizing that data. If they don't have it, they can't wait until they measure it. They're going to synthesize it, meaning they're going to generate numbers, right? So he developed this methodology, which he called SAR, again, stream flow synthesis and reservoir regulation. And it was basically the granddaddy of all the hydrologic models in the US, because it is dated in the middle 50s. And the Stanford watershed model, which is considered to be, I guess, is the daddy, I guess, of the models, hydrologic models in the US, it's dated 1964 or 63. And this was 55 that this gentleman was working out there in Portland District, Army Corps of Engineers. So it is widely considered the granddaddy of all hydrologic models. Now, I don't know where he got it, but he presented and introduced the concept of cascade linear reservoirs. And as a matter of fact, he generated 3 parts of the hydrograph because he was simulating hydrographs. The 3 parts of the hydrograph, he called them, the runoff, quick runoff, the intermediate or inner flow, and then base flow. And he was using the cascade, the tool of the cascade, in order to simulate all 3 of them. These are 3 different types of runoff, which should not be confused with each other. They don't intermingle. They're kind of separated, and then they get together at the end where you measure the hydrograph. So there was a good contribution. And subsequently, as time progressed, the Stanford watershed developed other methodologies. They did not get into the cascade linear reservoirs, to my knowledge. I don't think they did. No, positively, because I reviewed the Stanford. For when I wrote my book, I think I reviewed the Stanford. They used other things, but we're not talking about the Stanford here. So right after that, then I had the fortune to meet personally with Don Newton. Somehow I went over there and met him. By the time he was already retired or retiring, he precedes me a generation. You can imagine that. But the lucky thing with me was that I remember the reason why I went to visit him. It was later on. It was like in the late 70s, 80s, that I had a consulting assignment in Brazil. So I went over there. They wanted me to do some routing. They hired me because I was Mr. Router at the time, young man, but knew how to route. So I went over there, and I was there for 2 months, and I was supposed to do the routing on the Paraguay. The project was, the assignment was that the agency that hired me was supposed to do 13 dams, and they wanted to find out what was going to be the result or the effect of the 13 dams when they were fully operating on the flow downstream. Because dams have a way of holding onto the water. And the people downstream, namely the other countries downstream, were complaining that the Brazilian government was going to hold on to the water and we're not going to leave any water. And says that's an international river, that somebody had to go in and do some calculations. So they hired me, and I went over there, spent a couple months, used all the knowledge that I had already developed at school. But I learned the SAR model, because to be honest with you, I didn't know anything about the SAR model. I had basically heard about it, but one thing is hearing, another thing is doing it. So I had to learn the SAR model quickly over there, because that's what we were going to be working with. And fortunately, I wasn't doing the SAR part, but I had to interact with it. But I was doing the headwater basins, and that was different. So at any rate, long story made short is that I was introduced to the SAR model. I had to study it. And then when I finally understood the SAR model and the cascade of linear reservoirs, which is a big part of the SAR model, I decided to write a paper. And then I think it was at the time that I went to Portland and visited with the gentleman. I got him right at the end of his period of work, I guess, because he had been working since the 40s, just like Marcus in some sense, probably of the age of Marcus, on that order. A generation precedes me, a generation. At any rate, so that's the story of how I got involved. And I wrote a paper, which we are going to review hopefully today. I don't want to go too much on the history because we're not going to have time. We have to cover 3 major papers here today. So what is the cascade? Widely used method of hydrologic catchment routing is hydrologic catchment routing, based on the connection of several linear reservoirs in series. So you take a linear reservoir, you put them together, and it's a way of numerically creating diffusion. And it only creates diffusion, by the way, because the cascade of linear reservoirs doesn't have any convection. However, because you have so many of them, the appearance of convection is already implicit in the answer. In other words, you create and produce so much diffusion that it looks like that the wave, because we're calculating waves, that the wave did convect, when in fact it didn't convect. It just diffused the heck out of it, and it ended up showing as convection. So this is one interesting comment, that we're supposed to be doing convection and diffusion. This method only does diffusion, but it does it so much that it looks like it convects. We have said that in various papers. Okay. So there is 2 parameters, and there's one parameter, which is the K of the reservoir, and there's another parameter, which is the number of reservoirs that you're going to run through the flow. Let me also say that in 1964, Vintage Chow, published his manual of hydrology, famous manual of hydrology, and he already included this method in 1964, which is what he had to do because he was covering everything. As you probably know, when somebody writes a manual, they don't really write the manual. They supervise, they hire everybody to do it. But every chapter is done by a specialist. So I'm not going to say that Chow was a specialist. He was the lead man, and he was the organizer and the boss. He was the boss of the manual. I'm not sure if a big role he had in writing the section of the cascade, but it is in the manual. By the way, the Chow Manual 1964 has been superseded in 1993 by the new Hydrology Manual, which does not have his name anymore because he died in 1981. In 1993, that was 12 years later, right? So these are the formulas, and this is basically reservoir routing repeated several times. So if you are not understanding the concept of reservoir routing, I would suggest that you go back to chapter 8 of my book, because we don't have the time to get in there. We have covered briefly, but you gotta do some heavy study here to understand everything we're saying here today, as well as Wednesday. Okay, so we have these procedures for reservoir routing, which we're going to repeatedly do in terms of the number of reservoirs. Now, Professor Ponce, being who he is, did not like the fact that both Newton as well as all the other people were talking about delta T over K as delta T over K. As a matter of fact, Newton was calling it something else like storage or something. And I realized that that was a Courant number, and I started calling it a Courant number. And at this point, I don't know whether it has stuck, but I call it a Courant number. In my book, it's all Courant number. It's all about Courant. So the concept of Courant number gives us very easy to understand formulas that are in there. And for application to catchment routing, and we get all these equations, you got to review these equations because the homework is going to ask you to do some work with it. Okay. And what actually happened in here is that we developed, since we know the routing, we developed equation 1010. Okay. But we realized that the SAR model was doing the same thing, but with equation 1011. So the issue is, how come Don Newton didn't get to equation 1010, which is a normal equation, the standard equation, I guess you could say the easy equation to solve, and not 1011, which is not easy. But he did it. He did it that way. So if you go to the SAR model, if you review the SAR model, I don't know why would you do that now? Because I think the SAR model is pretty much dead. Why am I saying that? Because what happened was that in the early 90s, the models that did not become GUI, like RAS and HMS, were basically dead on the water. And I do not believe that the Army Corps at that time had the wherewithal to transition from character cell to raster, to GUI. And so the model is not used anymore because it doesn't have the peripherals and so forth, the interfaces and stuff. There's various other models that did that, like the EPA model and so on and so forth. So various groups of people that develop models in the United States, typically they are federal agencies, had to move to the GUI environment. Back in the middle 90s, by the year 2000, everybody was GUI. And that's because the response to the issue that Windows came about. Windows came about around the early 90s. I would say 91, 92, you can Google. When was the first issue of Windows? And interesting, and me being Professor Ponce cannot omit saying what I said what I'm going to say, although people may not like it. The word Windows precedes Microsoft. There was X Windows, which was developed in the 80s, and I used X Windows at the beginning because I was a Unix user. But then all of a sudden in the early 90s, Microsoft took over the word Windows and basically appropriated it. So now if you say in the computer or any place, you say Windows, people don't even think you're referring to the actual window out there at your home, but rather the Windows software of Microsoft. So be it. Okay, so that is the formulas that we're going to be using here. 1010 is the one we use in our models, in our calculators, and 1011 is the one that Army Corps of Engineers uses, but they are equivalent. They are the same. They have the same answer. Although it may not look like they do, but they actually do. And that's why I wanted you to become a little bit of a detective and figure out where the Don Newton went astray, like on a side, and he came up with this formula, which works because it is a correct formula. 1010 and 1011 are an identity. They're the same. Okay. Okay, so now we have an example in here, and this is the example. And by the way, when we do this, we typically strive very hard to make it as clear as we can, because I believe that in a book, you have to make it clear. In a technical paper, like a professional paper or a research paper, you don't have to make it clear. Because I think I already said earlier, if you make it too clear, it'll bounce. So you have to kind of be tricky a little bit. I'm gonna make it clear, but not too clear. But for a book, no. For a book, you got to make it clear. People are paying for the book and they want the stuff directly without any problems or any difficulties. So I have in here explained everything about the cascade in detail. Column 1 shows the time in hours. Let's take a look at column 1 in here. The time in hours. The intervals is 6 hours. I believe in this example, the interval is 6 hours. Yeah, the interval is 6 hours. The number of reservoirs is 3. The K, which is the storage constant for the linear reservoir, is 12. Okay, and delta T over K has to be less than 2. And in this case, it's 1/2, which is okay. And we'll see why later on. We'll see why it has to be less than 2 later on in the next paper. So column 1, column 2 shows the inflows to the first reservoir calculated by multiplying each one of the effective rainfall intensities times the basin area. Okay, so we have the basin area, the effective rainfall intensities is 0.2, here, 0.2, 1, 0.8, and 0.4. So those go in here, times 1,000, which is the area. Okay, the area is over here. 1,000 kilometers square. Note that this is a very big basin, because this method is appropriate for a big basin. This is not the rational method. We're beyond the rational method long time ago, 1,000 kilometers square. When Newton did his work, his original work, he used 500 kilometers or 500 miles, I think. But that can be 1,000, it could be 1,500 and so forth. It doesn't really matter. But note that it is all lumped, meaning there's only one answer, not many answers. We have to distinguish here lumped versus distributed. The difference is that lump gives you only one answer at the end, at the bottom, at the mouth of the basin. Distributed can give you as many answers as you want. 1,000, 10,000 inside, so. But distributed is another story. It's another way of doing it. We have both lumped and distributed. We have briefly talked about distributed in our previous chapter, last first section of the class. But obviously I didn't get into details. If I got into details, I could spend the whole semester just talking about that particular subject. And we don't have the time to do that. So column 2 is a multiplication of 1,000 times the inflows in here. Note the units in here, as we have already done, kilometers square centimeter per hour. And then we are going to do the routing of the reservoir. And it says in here, it's already in there, he says. Column 3 is the outflow from the first reservoir, which is by using this equation, by using equation 1010. Obviously, I cannot tell you everything because we will not finish, okay? But use equation 1010 and you get to column 3. Then column 4 is the average. 0 and 80, 40. 80 and 448, 264, etc. So this is the average because it's the average inflow of two values, the first value and the second value. And one may think that because you did a straight average, this is no good because there's linearities and there's non-linearities and so forth. And you know, numerical analysis is all about linearity versus non-linearity. But this method works. Exactly why? To be honest with you, I don't know, but it works. And I know it works because it conserves mass. And that's the first thing a method is required. If a method doesn't conserve mass, it's no good. If the method conserves mass, then it's good. And it could be verified or confirmed, etc. But it first has to conserve mass. And this method does conserve mass. Okay, so here the 40. Then we route it through the second reservoir, again following the same equation. Okay, second reservoir. Then we again take the average to calculate the inflow. The inflow is the average of the outflow, and 0 and 16 is 8 is the average, goes in here. 16 and 115 is 65, it goes in here. Okay, and then the inflow over here, and then we route again through the same equation that I just pointed out to you. You could route it through our method or Newton's method, same thing, they are the same equation, 1010 and 1011. And we finally get the outflow from the third reservoir. And then we multiply that times 2.78, I believe, 2.78 in order to convert it to cubic meters per second. You can do that just as an exercise. It's 2.78. So 3.20 becomes 8.89. So that's basically it. Now, note in here that the outflow over here was 588, right? The peak, 588, because it goes 400, 500, 513. This is the peak at time 18. At 18 hours, we have a first peak after the first reservoir. And the second one is 396. That's at 30 hours. Can you see that? That's the peak. And the third one is 308. At 36 hours, we have 308. And then everything else coming down. That means that at every instance of a reservoir, we are diffusing the flow. We are diffusing the flow. Not only are we diffusing the flow, we are conserving mass. The mass should be 2,400. And with all these calculations that we have done, rather coarse actually, extremely coarse, and yet the conservation is almost 100%. Look, it should be 2,400. It's 2399.83. 2399.83. Amazing. I'm just totally amazed. I've been doing this for 50 years. I'm still amazed. And I'll continue to share my amazement with you, not only today, but also Wednesday. Okay. And in here, likewise. So this method is good. Okay. And we have a calculation with the online routing. What is the basin area? Wait a second. The basin area is 1,000. Let me see. Oh, yeah. I did it this afternoon. I didn't want to. Okay. And in here, the storage constant is 12. And the number of reservoir is 3, I believe. And the time interval is 6. And the number of increments of storage is 4. Right? And the increments of storage, I just have to kick it in here. That's it. That's it. That is it. Beautiful. What's the peak flow in here? 857, right? The peak flow of the outflow. 857 is the peak flow. Okay, and over here, the peak flow is 857. So all I did is just took this calculation and put it in the computer. And I'm going to say that the computer calculation is a little more accurate because we did this by hand. And in by hand, you use at most 4 significant digits, but the computer can use 7. So it's a little more accurate, the computer one. It doesn't matter because the accuracy is, the difference is so small that you probably couldn't, from an engineering standpoint, if it's less than 5%, something like that, it's okay. I told you already, hydrology can be 30% in error and it's okay. And here we're looking very, very small differences between the hand calculation and the computer calculation. So with this then, we have completed this example of the cascade of linear reservoirs. You have to go back and take a look at it. Don't just take everything I said. You have to go back and take a look at it and make sure that every box in here, that you know where it comes from. And if you can't figure it out, then you have 2 choices. Go back and look at it again and try to make sure you understand it, or else you can always ask me and share a story with you. After this comes the kinematic and diffusion waves, which is more complicated than this. And I thought I had done it there because I needed to do it. I needed to show people how this is done. Okay, and you can do it very complex or very simple. And I decided to do simple, linear form mode. And I wrote it in the book. And the reason why I wrote it in the book was because I felt that I had to put something new in there before anybody tells me, oh, that's old stuff. You know, you have to be careful about that. You have to be new, not too new, but not too old either. So we put that in there, and for many years, like 20 years, nobody said anything. And one day, about 10 years, 15 years ago, I get a call from somebody or an email from somebody that wanted me for me to tell him how I got that table of the kinematic wave routing, because he wanted to study kinematic wave routing, and he found it in my book, and he tried to reproduce what I had done, and he couldn't. That's really, it was fascinating for me that one person in 40 years did that. That one person sat down to try to figure out if I was correct or wrong, which could happen, by the way. I can make mistakes. But that was not a mistake. He's just kind of confused because the stuff was complex. So I sat down and explained it to him in an email and so forth. So as you can see, these stories happen. So the cascade linear reservoirs provide a convenient mechanism for simulating a wide range of catchment routing problems. You can do just about anything. As a matter of fact, we have proven that that is the case, but I'll tell you the story on Wednesday. Furthermore, the method may be applied to each runoff component separately, like Don Newton did in the early 50s. And in here, for instance, assume that a certain basin has 10 centimeters of runoff, of which it had separated it. 10 are for surface runoff, 2 subsurface runoff, and 1 base flow. This is interesting because this is the only method that I know that actually splits the runoff into 3: surface runoff, subsurface, and base flow. Because any other method cannot do it. They don't do the second one. They just do 1 and 2 and 3, and incorporate the 2 mostly in the 1, not in the 3, because the 3 is really base flow. It's a different process. It's an underground process on its own, right? But subsurface is difficult to model. And I can tell you off the bat that I do not believe there is really a practical model out there that is modeling subsurface runoff other than the SAR method. The SAR method is doing it. So this is a good tool. At the beginning of when I started doing this back in the year 1979, I was kind of a little bit doubtful. I said, what is this Mickey Mouse and cascade of linear reservoirs and K and N? But time went by and I was proven to be wrong. This is not Mickey Mouse. It makes a heck of a lot of sense. And I'll get to that Wednesday. Okay. I must say that at the time, I didn't know the total foundations of this thing. That was 1979, 1980. We were using it. We were a little suspicious, but not so much. But we did write that paper where we explained it. Back in the year 2009, 20 years later, it all came into place completely like a jigsaw puzzle. So we've been doing this for now 13 years, telling everybody that this is a better way to do it. To do the whole thing, as a matter of fact. Catchment of linear reservoirs is a great method. But yet, time has to go by before people out there use it and first understand it and use it. So from here, this next section is on the kinematic waves, which we're not going to cover that. I just got through telling you that is the tough one. Okay, so the cascade of linear reservoirs, we already seen the calculator. So now we're going to go to this paper, linear reservoirs and numerical diffusion. This is a very interesting paper. What happened was that back in the late 70s, I was enamored is the word, with the Conch methodology. I really thought that was great. And then, because I thought that was physical, very good. It was a very good method. It was a physical method, mechanical method, how can I say, deterministic method. We wrote a paper in the middle 80s calling it deterministic calculation of basin hydrology, because I thought the Conch method was deterministic, which it is, by the way. And so then I was into Brazil. And of course, they didn't want anything to do with the Conch method. They were into the cascade of linear reservoirs. How had that happened that the Brazilians were in the cascade? Well, that's an interesting story. The Brazilians had to do modeling back in the late 60s because they got a whole pile of money from the United Nations, and they had to do not only field measurements in the Brazilian Alto Paraguay basin, but somebody told them that it was 1968 or 1970, and they had to do modeling. So they hired the modelers. The modelers went out there looking for a model to use, and probably at that time, the US models were the only ones that they could use. Later on, they developed their own, but that was later on. At the time, talking 1968, they didn't have any. So I wasn't there, so I'm not privy to the decisions that were made, but all I know is that they chose the SAR model because they thought it was the one that was gonna give them less theoretical problems. Because Don Newton had already tested it in the Columbia. They had 20 years of experience with the SAR model in the Columbia. So the guys in Brazil said, we're going to go, American Corps of Engineers recommended that we use the SAR model. So we're going to, so they started using the SAR model out there back in the 68, 78. For 10 years, they were using the SAR model. And here comes Professor Ponce in 1979, and they present to me the whole thing. We've been doing this for 10 years. So, and besides, I had not been hired to do the modeling. I only had been hired to do the upland basin modeling, which is small compared to the big one. Imagine you have a huge basin, and then you have 7 little basins on top that are supposed to put some water into the huge basin. That was my job. My job wasn't, I could not, in all probability or reality, could not take the job of doing the huge model that had already been in operation for 10 years. That was it for only 2 months. I went as a quick in and out, do the stuff that you have to do and see you later. Okay, so that was the story of why the SAR model was in Brazil. But then when I came back, I looked at it and I said to myself, these guys somehow, I have a hunch that they're doing some numerical diffusion. That was my hunch because I already had extensively studied the Conch model, which is based on numerical diffusion. So I said, I bet there's something in here, similarities that we could kind of find and clarify. Because at the time, the issue of numerical diffusion was a mystery, and it remains a mystery to this date, by the way. Very few people really understand the concept of numerical diffusion. And that is the reason why there is difficulty around the world in applying the Conch method. Because before they apply it, they have to use it, right? And that is if you're going to use it as a sole user. Because you could use the Muskingum Conch method as part of the HMS model. But allow me to say this, that's a kind of a blind method. I mean, you can go in there and run the model, you know, like people that not very respectful people say GIGO, which stands for, in English, garbage in, garbage out. Meaning, if you don't know what you're doing, what's coming out of the model is garbage, which is correct, by the way. Oh, the stories on that, I can tell you endless numbers of stories of modeling, not knowing how to model. Modeling is an issue that you're not supposed to get the right answer. The model is not there to give you the right answer. Modeling is there to give you a range of answers that correspond with your experience on what you're going to get out of the problem. If you want a model to give you the one answer, you don't know what you're doing. The model is going to give you several what-if answers. And then from there, you're going to use your judgment in order to get the right answer. But the model is going to give you not one right answer. The model is going to give you many answers. Most people don't know that, unfortunately. They hope that they can get the answer from the model. No, there's many answers, which depends on the what-if conditions of the modeling range. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about linear reservoirs. So I wrote this paper because I felt that the submodel basically was really intrinsic within it was the issue of numerical diffusion, which Conch had already explained. So conceptual models are presently being used to simulate watershed response. This is a kind of a conceptual model. It's a conceptual hydrologic model. It is not physical. It is not deterministic. It is conceptual. It's like the Kerr number, which is also conceptual. They're not, you can't count physically the reservoirs that you're going to use. You're counting them in the CPU of the computer. The computer knows what it is going to do, the equation that I already shown you. But it's not physical. Okay, so it's a conceptual model for sure. Okay, is the Marcus method physical? No, absolutely not deterministic. In that we agreed with Hawkins. It was not deterministic. It had to be conceptual because it was a good concept. We agree with that. Remember, we already talked about that. Okay, interestingly though, there was a gentleman originating, I believe, out of Ireland, Dr. Nash, who had already worked with this concept in an analytical shape. And he presented this equation. It's a very well-known equation, is the gamma function. The gamma function, it's a mathematical concept. So this mathematical concept gives you the answer to the cascade of linear reservoirs. Because anything that we do here numerically can be done analytically through this gamma function, by the way. And that is why the thing works so well, by the way. I'll explain that later on in more detail. Okay, so the numerical analog is the routing equation used in the SAR model, correct, developed by the Portland District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Why would one prefer a numerical when you have an analytic? That's a very interesting issue. The analytic is beautiful and the numerical is kind of, you know, well, it's numerical, it's dirty. But the point is that that's the one that you will have to use in practice, because in practice, the boundary conditions are not going to be specified nicely. So if you don't have a nice boundary condition, you cannot use the analytic. That's as simple as that. So you have to use a numerical. So you can always fall back and resort to the numerical model, because the numerical model is going to allow you to get an answer, which you cannot get all the time with an analytical model. That's the defense, or not the argument of defense, that's the rationale for the extensive use of numerical models, the boundary conditions. Okay, so that's the story on this. Now we're going to make a comparison in here, or we're not doing a comparison. We're going to say, we're going to bring in the issue of the Muskingum and the Muskingum Conch, because at the time we were so hot on the Muskingum Conch that we were talking Muskingum Conch any opportunity that we had. That was 40 years ago, by the way, and we still are. Progress is slow. Okay, so the kinematic wave and numerical diffusion. That's another story in here. In 1986, we put together a paper, which we have shared with you in the past, and I believe we already shared it in this class, in the first section of the class, the first part of the class. In 1986, I came out with the diffusion wave modeling, which, and I kind of got the Army Corps Davis by surprise, because they were not expecting me to write such a paper, because they didn't know. They were hot on the kinematic wave routing that MIT had put together in the year 1973. And since MIT has such a huge name, they weren't going to argue with MIT. So they were pushing, not the word pushing, they were selling. No, not selling is not good either. They were saying that the kinematic wave routing was the way to go. 1980, after MIT's 1973. And here comes Professor Ponce in 1986 saying that no, there's a better way, a better mousetrap. And the better mousetrap is come diffusion wave. Interestingly, though, the publications of these ASCE are read by people that are in research. So they read the paper, and then they invited me to go out there to tell them my story. And I did in 1987. And there is a couple of videos of that experience, by the way, where I told them what I thought about it, about the subject. The story is longer than that, but I'm going to cut it down. And I'm going to say that I went there in 1987 and told them how you could do the diffusion wave, which I had already published in 1986. So they went ahead and basically they were caught by surprise, and they spent 3 years doing it. And in 1990, they came up with the Muskingum Conch in HEC1. And then in 1998, they morphed to HMS. So now HMS has the remnants of the Muskingum Conch of HEC1 and so on and so forth. It's a big enchilada, I guess you could say, a salad of many things. But our contributions, 1986, are there. And if you go to the manual, you'll see my names plastered in places where they talk about the Muskingum Conch. And the Muskingum Conch is part now of the HMS. It is part of, it used to be part of HEC1 in 1990. Then in HMS, because HMS is just about 99% of HMS is just the GUI version of Head 1. Okay, so the Conch method was incorporated. The Conch method is based on the kinematic wave equation, which is 3 in here, and then we have the equations of the Muskingum. These are the equations of the Muskingum dating back to 1938. McCarthy in 1938 came up with the Muskingum method. Why Muskingum? Because McCarthy was working for the Army Corps, and he was in Ohio somewhere. And he was looking for a nice, good river that he could try this idea that he had. And I wasn't there. This is 1938. I wasn't even born in 1938. That he chose the Muskingum River, and he did his original Muskingum modeling in the Muskingum River. And that's why he called it the Muskingum Basin, no, Muskingum method. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, because I never was privy to the actual publication, which was never published. But it was put in so many important pieces of work that everybody started referring to the McCarthy method, the Muskingum method. Because obviously McCarthy was not going to say he just published the method, that's it. But long story made short is that That became the Muskingum method after the use of McCarthy or the development of McCarthy in 1938. So these are the formulas for the Muskingum method, in which the K is the famous K, is the same K that we've been talking about all day today. And the X is an additional one. The X is the weighting factor. And of course, McCarthy, at the time he was doing this, 1938, could not envision that this was more complicated than what it looked. He thought it was easy, but it was more complicated. And as a matter of fact, he could not come up with an X value that made any sense. But he tried a whole lot, and the method was stable and good, provided you were doing a few things correctly. And therefore, the method sailed from 1938, 48, 58, 68. In 1969, working out of Europe, Ponce came up with this formula, Formula 8. He basically amended the work of McCarthy. He said, wait a second, guys, X is not something you have to pull out of the air or pull out of the data. X can be found by making this formula where we have physical parameters in here. Q is the discharge per unit of width, the slope of the channel, the celerity of set done, and the X is the interval. So he basically tied the X to the interval. So X could no longer be played around without regards to the interval, because the interval was there. And how did this formula originate? Because he did something nobody had ever done, which is take the physical diffusion of the problem, which was Hayame's diffusion, and find the numerical diffusion of the problem and just match them, make them equal. And once they were made equal, then the X popped up out of the problem. And this is the formula. Now, admittedly, Ponce didn't get here. He got close to here, but in his wisdom, he couldn't do it. That was 1969. In that famous paper that those of you that took, it's not a famous paper, it is a defining paper in hydraulics and hydrology. So what was I gonna say? Oh, he said that. But then in 1975, the British, namely Price, working out of, I believe, either Wallingford, one of the big labs in England, they decided to manipulate a little bit for ease of understanding, and they came up with this equation 8, which I promptly adopted later on because it was a little easier than Ponce's. By the way, what I'm talking about here happens all the time. The guy that does the original work doesn't finish it because he didn't want to or because he couldn't. And that's what happened to Ponce. I think Ponce got embroiled in it and he couldn't finish it, but Price was fresh out of it and he said, oh, we're gonna do this. And I agree with the procedure, Price, by the way. You gotta clarify it eventually for usage. So this is Price's equation, which we adopted. And then by the time you do that, then you get the C and D. The Courant numbers falls into place. But not only the Courant number falls into place, the cell Reynolds number also falls into place. So here we got another number here that nobody ever talked about. And this is what we did in this paper, by the way. We came up, no, actually in a previous paper 2 years earlier. And then we just proceeded to explain a little bit more. Where did I get the cell Reynolds number stuff? Because it is not a Reynolds number. So it had to be qualified. And there's a book by, I don't remember his name. I don't remember a whole lot of things now. But there was 1972 book by a gentleman working out of fluid mechanics, right, that had originally discussed or created the cell Reynolds number, but it was not the same. It was a different expression, and it was for fluid mechanics, which is a different field, by the way. One thing is fluid mechanics, another thing is hydrology, another thing is hydraulics. Here we're talking here in the midst between hydraulics and hydrology, because flood routing, which is what we're doing here, stands in the middle between one and the other. It's neither one nor the other. It's right in the middle. So those that do flood routing cannot call themselves strict hydrologists or hydraulics because they're in the middle. Okay, so that's the cell Reynolds number, which leads to these equations, which are my equations, but I don't know if people still use them or use them a lot. I don't know. I think eventually they will, but it will take a long time. It will take a long time. So we have a classical approach to Muskingum-Ponce method. That's the classical approach, we already know. Then the linear reservoirs. There's also the issue of the Kalinin-Yukov, the Russian method, which is a variation. We put it in here I'm not gonna tell you why, but we added this in here, the Kalinim Yukov, because at the time it was mentioned by a whole lot of people, and I said, this is popular. I don't want to miss it, because if I miss it, people are gonna say, hey, why didn't you talk about that? Right? Because when you submit a paper for review, people can say that. Why didn't you talk about that? Or why did you talk about this too much? But it has happened many times to me, by the way. People sometimes don't like that you omitted something, and they also don't like that you put too much of this, because the reviewer has been hired as a reviewer, not paid. It's not a paid job, but he gives an opinion, and the opinion has to be respected. That's all I can tell you at this point, because he is the reviewer, he's the boss. Okay, so then we have the star routing equation, which we have it in here, and we have the equation 20, which is the one we got, and we rearranged it, which is the star routing equation. And I've asked you to do that rearrangement. Not easy, by the way. That's a couple hours of work. Maybe not a couple, maybe an hour. Or if you all lock out, you'll do it in 20 minutes, but that's what's going to take. Okay, cascade of linear reservoirs. So now we go into the cascade now. Now we're going to route that Newton problem, exactly his original problem, the problem that he used to develop this stuff, with our parameters, not that Newton, so our parameters. We're modifying, we're changing this a little bit, we're making it hopefully easier. So now we're going to route the inflow, which is 50,000 CFS, I believe, for 6 hours. Yeah, it's for 6 hours, exactly. 6 hours, yeah, it's 6 hours. It's 6 hours over here, 2, 3, 4, 24 hours, right? Notice that this is 24 hours. This is a huge basin, right? And so now we have in here, if we use a Current number 2, we get this. Then number one reservoir, we get this answer, the hydrograph, calculated by the cascade of linear reservoirs. Then 2, 5, 10, 9, up to 9. That's for Current number 2. For Current number 0.8, you will get this, like smooth, right? More diffusion. For Current number 0.4, smooth, more diffusion. Newton knew this, so he was going to use this part over here for the surface runoff. This part over here for the inner flow, slowly. And this part over here for the base flow. And you can even get down below 0.1, although I don't really think it's necessary. But I personally have not run SAR model. I was playing, I was near it, but I personally did not run SAR model. Because to run a SAR model, you got to have a big budget. It's a huge thing. And I was not hired to do that. I was hired to do I already told you, the upland basins. So I don't know if the 0.1 in here is low enough, but you can go back and get to 0.05 and get a flatter curve in here, flatter and flatter. But I stopped it there. So that was the response. So we, of course, understood that that was the case and how he had done it. We knew that Don Newton had in his hands a methodology by which you could get any answer. Because look at the range in here. This over here is a reproduction of the rational method, because the rational method creates an isosceles triangle, meaning it's a triangle. It's not smooth because it lacks total diffusion. It doesn't have any diffusion. I think I already told you that if the hydrograph is smooth, it has diffusion. If it's sharp, it doesn't have diffusion. This one is very sharp in here. Can you see the sharp edge in here? So the rational method has no diffusion, only convection, and you can simulate the rational method by saying n equal 1 and c equal 2. And you will simulate the rational method, no doubt about that. That's not going to be correct for the size of the basin, that's another story. But you can generate the number, okay? So so we found this out and we learned from it. We're learning every day, okay? So we have in here the summary and conclusions. Conceptual model, now I summarize here. The conceptual model of cascade, in particular, the SAR routing equation, is reviewed in the light of the theory of numerical diffusion. The SAR routing equation is shown to be a special case of the Muskingum routing equation. Since the latter simulates the diffusion process by off-centering the temporal derivative in its discrete formulation, it follows that the same numerical diffusion mechanism underlies the SAR routing equation and its associated linear reservoir assumption. The extension of the technique to a cascade, thus providing an additional parameter for simulation purpose, is readily envisioned. In practice, the use of a conceptual model such as a cascade remains a problem of system ID. Given an excitation, meaning excess rainfall, and system response based in outflow, you have the input and the output, and you're going to find the system ID, meaning the characteristics of the system by trial and error. It can be done. And we have an example that we're going to cover Wednesday on that. Extensive example that we have done on this method, by the way. The model parameters are the Courant number and the number of reservoirs. Once the parameters are determined, it is hoped that they can be used to predict the stages of the modeling. To be honest with you, I'm going to share with you something interesting. I do not understand why people resist the use of the Courant number. I think is the most important and the easiest concept in all numerical hydraulics, and yet is not a very well-known number. Not a very well-known number. Back in the early stage of my career, back in the late 80s, I believe, I gave a task to one of the students to do for graduate student. And he came back, and at that time we used to do Fortran, by the way. That was the only thing that you could do. In engineering, there were other methods, but they were not engineering methods. But now you have umpteen ways of doing skin the gap, but out there, no, only Fortran. So this student of mine was doing Fortran modeling and so forth. He came back after a month or so, and he said, Professor Ponce, I can't make any sense of this method. Help me out, please. I said, what are you doing? Well, I knew I had assigned him to do the routing, the watershed modeling and so forth. And he said, yeah, well, okay, fine. So I have first question to ask you. What's your Courant number? And he said, should I know the Courant number? I said, if you don't know what's your approximate Courant number in this methodology, you're not going to get anywhere. And he said, oh, okay. So I told him, this is the number. Okay, that's the number over there. See, the Courant number is the ratio of the physical celerity to the numerical celerity, simply stated. We can go back in there, but it's no matter. It doesn't matter really. Over here. There it is. The physical celerity to the numerical celerity is the Courant number. How easy a concept. So he went back to the drawing board, and a couple of weeks later, came back to me, and I am not kidding you. He said, he smiled in his face. Oh, I told him, I said, try to make sure the Courant number is close to 1. In this method, it has to be, otherwise you're going to be trash out of the computation. Because if it's too low, it blows up on their face. And if it's too high, it gives you an answer, but it's not the good answer. It's the wrong answer. Okay, so he came back 2 weeks, 2, 3 weeks later, and a smile on his face, big smile on his face. He said, Professor Ponce, I'm not kidding you. He said, Professor Ponce, you're a genius. I said, no, really, I've been around. And he said, I set the Courant number equal to 1 very closely. I monitored it, and lo and behold, the system worked beautifully. These are the answers. I already have the answers to this problem. I say, yes, that's the way it is. You got to respect the parameters, the numerical parameters. Actually, the Courant number is not a numerical parameter. It's the ratio, it's the tie, it's the glue between the physics and the numerics. Can now be said in a clearer way. Okay, so that's the routing equation. And likewise with the cell Reynolds number, by the way. So what's the difference between the Courant number and the cell Reynolds number? The Courant number is talking about convection, has nothing to do with diffusion. And the cell Reynolds number is talking about diffusion and has nothing to do with convection. That's the story. Okay, so we got in here now, and now we realize that we have a tool. So then the question is how to use it. And I'm going to show you Wednesday how to use it very effectively. So we finish in here. We got 20 minutes to go. And I'm going to get in this paper in here. And if I don't finish it, no problem, because we have next Wednesday to finish it up. We have 3 other things that we got to do, but we can speed things up and so on and so forth. I can only use the time I have. I cannot use any more. You can use the time you want to use. An hour, 2, 3, 5 hours, that's your issue here, because the issue is an issue of learning this stuff. Because it's an exposure, if your exposure to new ideas, new concepts that you may need to use later on in your career. One never ceases learning, never. The only people that cease learning are and I'm not going to say that in a bad way, although it sounds bad. A technician is not an engineer. Technician is trained for a couple of months to do a job that he or she does forever. The engineer is not trained technically in that same way. You're supposed to expand your horizons every once in a while and so forth. You're a professional, not a technician. You see, that's the difference. Okay, so a general dimension is unit hydrograph. I have to tell you the history of this paper. It's very dear to my, I guess you could have to my heart. Okay, in the year 2009, I think I'm going to go fast because I already told you the story. So this is a repeat. Year 2009, I knew that that previous paper had something in there that I had not learned yet. So I gave this to a student. I said, you know what we need to do? We need to take these graphs, the ones that are in here, I just show you the several graphs of the Quran. We got to take these graphs and put them in a dimensionless way. And I know it can be done. I haven't done it, but it can be done. 2009. And he went over and spent 4 months on it and he couldn't do it. So at the end, he said, Professor Ponce, you give me a job, I can't finish and so forth. So I kind of felt bad because I said to myself, well, what grade am I going to give this guy now? He didn't complete the work. He got started and he stopped. And I did realize at the time that it was a difficult job. So I sat down to do it. I said, I'm going to have to do this. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. So I spent about a week, maybe 10 days doing this work that I'm going to present to you today. Have to figure it out with the experience that we had and so on and so on. And we did it. We did it. We came up with, it's general because it's a global applicability. It can be applied in Timbuktu as well as in Arizona, okay? It's dimensionless. That means because of that, its strength is dimensionless and therefore it's global. And it's a unit hydrograph. What is a unit hydrograph? Let's repeat that for clarity's sake. A unit hydrograph is a tool to model diffusion. To model diffusion and maybe convection if you want to. But what you really want to model is diffusion. Why? Because the convection problem is a simple problem. It's a rational method problem. But by the time you get to diffusion, it's not that easy. And that's what Sherman in 1932 said. He said to himself, I cannot do this with the convection problem only. Namely because he knew that Krieger had already told everybody that they couldn't do it. You can't do the rational method, extrapolate the rational method because you're not going to be calculating any diffusion. So he set about to create a diffusion by all this methodology, the unit hydrograph. But he was not aware, and at the time, this concept of cascade linear reservoirs had not been developed. So he was not counting on the issue of cascade linear reservoirs. Now afterwards, now we came about. But let me also tell you something in anticipation of what I'm going to say later, Wednesday, that I was really surprised to find out that there is not a similarity. There's an identity between what Sherman did and what Newton did over in Portland, Don Newton. It's like you're looking at two sides of the same coin. And if you turn it around, you end up with the convolution. And if you turn it the other way around, you end up with the cascade. And I say that because we have applied this methodology to a very specific problem, both methodologies, and they come up with the same answer. And the same answer to the 6th significant digit. That is not magic. That is truism, a truism of nature. Nature decided to express in this way these two methodologies. They are basically the same. I do not believe, I could be wrong on this, that this had been said. People talk about this method, talk about that other method, but they did not say. But we came out and said it because we came up with the same answer. And I'm going to ask you to do that too. The same answer in two methods. We have two calculators. And if you do it the right way, and the right way is not easy, but you have to do it the right way. And if you do it the right way, you get the same answer. From both methodologies, which are apparently totally different and originating in totally different concepts. The magic of nature, I call that. Okay, so unit hydrograph, we already know. The etc. The linear reservoirs, we already know. Those are this is a rehash. We had to start there. Linear hydrograph, linear reservoirs. The cascade linear reservoirs, we already know. the dimensionless unit hydrograph. Here is where what parameter are you going to use to dimensionalize? Because if you don't use the right parameter, you're going to mess up. You're never going to get there. And a case in point, when Ferrick did his work on the third order equation of flow, because Seddon had done the first order, 1900. Hayami had done the second order, 1951. He went, in other words, more accurate, 1951 out of Japan. And Ferrick in 84, in 84, he was trying to do the third order. Third order convection, diffusion, dispersion equation, because convection first order, diffusion second order, and dispersion is the third order. As a matter of fact, Ferrick was the first one to call it dispersion, because there was all kinds of people trying to say things here and there, but they would not agree. But he called it dispersion. It was a good name. I picked it up. Many people picked it up. So the third order process became dispersion. And by the way, there's a long story about what is the difference between diffusion and dispersion. We don't have the time to discuss that here. I briefly talked about that in computational hydraulics. But the point is that Ferrick could not do it because he picked up the wrong dimensionalization. He couldn't do it. And he, having some experience, he said, you know what? I mean, we couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Ferrick couldn't do it. And then he said, well, that's it. So he presented it, and he didn't generalize anything because he couldn't do it. Then I came in later, a few years later, and I realized that Ferrick had not completed the job, and that it could be done. So I spent some time on it, a few days or so. Sometime, I don't know, it was like, I think it was 1995 or something like that. And I actually dimensionalized it correctly because I had experience with the S-curve. Non-dimensionalized it correctly with characteristic reach length, and so on and so forth, that those of you that have taken computational hydraulics heard me talk about the characteristic reach length, the L sub O over D sub O. And we did it. We came up with dimensionless third order convection, diffusion, dispersion equation, and we wrote a paper on it, which we published in 1989. That was 89, not 95, 89 in the journals, well respected. We even have a video on that. Never mind that that the third order component is pure theory. It's not applicable in practice. It's beautiful, numerically and physically beautiful. But I would venture to say that in order to use correctly or properly the third order, you'd have to have a very singular and unusual problem. And that's probably not going to present itself in practice. But that has to be done. Somebody's got to be upfront, and we are, and we're upfront. So we find the T sub R in here. To dimensionalize the hydrograph, you have to find the T sub R. It has to be the T sub R, which is the duration of the hydrograph. And the dimensionless discharge is got to be Q max, which is the convection value, the maximum discharge attained in the absence of runoff diffusion. These are very important concepts. In other words, you got to pick up the right thing, otherwise it's not going to work. And we did pick up the right thing because we have experience. Besides, it took us 25 years to do this. This was done in 2009. And we have been working on these issues since 1977. So how many years was that? 23, 30, 34 years, 32 years. It took us from the S-curve to this paper. Okay, so we proceed in here, and all this stuff can be followed. The fundamental issues are the T sub R and the A. And then we find that general dimensionless unit hydrograph may be generated using the CLR method. The CLR method is a cascaded linear reservoirs. The resulting set of Q star and T star are the dimensionless values. There's a story on that, nice story that I am going to share with you because Professor Ponce is Professor Ponce. I decided, in my wisdom, as they say, to not use star because I thought that star was clumsy, cumbersome. So I used a caret, a little hat that you put on the Q, which puts it on the top of the Q, not on the side, and use that in my S-curve theory. And I found out later on that people were so afraid of the caret that they weren't reading the paper. And I didn't want to use the asterisk because I didn't like it. And Einstein had been originally or presumably one of the first ones to use the asterisk as a dimensionless value in his papers, in his paper in particular. So I shied away from Einstein's, and then later on I came back because I realized, I mean, you know, you can't beat yourself against the wall. So we changed eventually when we HTML the paper, we changed from character from the little hat on top of the symbol to the star. And here is the star now for us. And star there, the Einstein star forever, because that's just the way people like it. They can relate to it. Okay, so therefore we got in here, continuation in here, and I urge you to read this. And hopefully you don't spend a whole lot of time digging through it because it is complex. And we finally, the unit hydrograph that's calculated may be convoluted with the effective storm hydrograph to determine the composite storm hydrograph. So there's a tie between these two methods in here. And if the tie is not done correctly, then they give different answers. The only way for them to give the right answer and correspond to the problem as stated in nature is to correctly get the tie in there. And we're going to do that, by the way. So we have an online version of the calculator. Is an online general UH cascade. So we're here. So I have several calculators in here. I believe it's 5 calculators because we went from easy to difficult. So for the Courant number equal 1, and for the number of reservoirs equal 3, okay, we are going to calculate the general dimensionless cascade linear reservoirs unit hydrograph. And this is it. Yes, this is it. The general dimensionless cascade. T star, Q star. You see, this is dimensionless. So that means it can be applied globally. Okay, based on hydraulics. So that's one example. Let me go back now in here. The second one, an online version is a function of, okay, in here, give the Courant number, let's say 1. 1 is in the middle, right? It cannot be more than 2. And that can be usually not less than 0.1. So 1 is in the middle. See this recommended range for 0.1 to 2. Enter 1 in the input box and click calculate. Okay. So now we got in here now. What do we have? The dimensionless time and the dimensionless discharge for any one of 10 reservoirs. So for 1 is this one, the vertical line shows 1 unit hydrograph. For 1 reservoir, 2 reservoirs, 3 reservoirs, 4 reservoirs, up to 10 reservoirs. And as you can see, look at this. The peak for 1 reservoir is 0.667. The peak for 2 reservoirs is 0.37. The peak for 3 reservoirs is 0.27. So it's working. It's showing that the more reservoirs, the more diffusion, which is the way it's supposed to be, right? For the 27 comes to 22. The 22 comes to 19. The 19 comes to 17. And it's a smooth process. Very nice calculation. Okay, so we have in here now, that's the second one. And now, furthermore, now we're going to calculate everything. And in here, we don't need to put any data. We just calculate. Did you see the speed? It is amazing, isn't it? It really is amazing because we calculated hundreds of thousands of calculations over here. And our servers do it in a fraction of a second. Okay. So we have in here a summary of dimensionless Q peak and T peak, right? Remember, this is dimensionless values. If you want to find the real values, you got to multiply by TR and Q and the Q max. Okay, so we have the Courant number in here. For the Courant number equal to this answer, with the 1 and 5 to 1. So we go all the way from 0.1, which is low, and these are very flat, as you can see, and these are somewhat very peaked. This is very peaked. It's so peaked that 4 and 5 are the same. That means between 4 and 5, there's an angle in there. That means it's peaked. Why? Because the Courant number is 2. And remember, I already told you, the Courant number 2 leads to peak answer because there's no diffusion, very little diffusion. Actually, there's some, but it's not manifested in the calculation because it's too high the Courant number. But if for the low Courant number, you get it, right? Courant number 2. Okay, and then the hydrographs, all the hydrographs. So every answer is here. The world of answers is written in here. That's right. That is right. It's the world of answers. So that's the procedure then. The procedure to derive a unit hydrograph is the following. Determine the basin area, we know that. Determine the unit interval T sub R, or the effective storm hydrograph. That's right. Which is the same as the T sub R. I mean, you call it T sub R. Is the effective storm hydrograph, it's T sub R. Run on lines all series to choose among a pair of 6 predetermined C values. If necessary, run on line series to calculate the dimensionless unit hydrograph. And if necessary, run on line U to calculate applicable dimensionless unit hydrograph for a given pair of C and N. Either the convolution method of CLR may be used to calculate the composite plot hydrograph. Now, if I have succeeded in confusing the heck out of you, so be it. Believe me, when I was starting this, I was also confused, but I just stuck it out until you get it, okay? Once you do it 3, 4, 5 times, then it's easy, but you have to do it. Convolution method. Using the generalized calculated unit hydrograph discharge is using equation 11 and the corresponding times using equation 12. And given the effective storm hydrograph in the unit hydrograph ordinance calculated in A, use the online convolution to calculate the composite plot hydrograph. And the online convolution is this guy over here. I'm not going to do it because, you know, it's more of the same. Hopefully, yeah, okay. And then you can use the convolution method, or you can use the cascade or linear resonance. I already told you. And that we don't do with online routing. This is the online routing. So you can use convolution, which comes from Sherman, or you can use the online routing, which comes from Don Newton. Totally, supposedly different methods. And yet the composite hydrographs calculated by both methods are shown to be almost exactly the same. This is one of the major surprises of my career. In other words, I certainly didn't expect. I thought they were going to be similar and that you could ascribe the differences to numerics. But this thing is so beautiful that it doesn't have hardly any difference. It's 99.99%. There are differences, but so small that should not be considered in any assessment of inaccuracy. It's accurate. Okay. Advantages and disadvantages. The procedure is global, applicable anywhere, and solely a function of C and N. C Courant number and N number of linear reservoirs. Unlike other established unit hydrograph procedures, such as ANRCS of Marcus or Snyder's for that matter. Snyder was working for the Army Corps of Engineers back in the middle 30s. The GDUH is a 2-parameter model. It's a 2-parameter model. So it has versatility to calculate convection and diffusion. Actually, it does not calculate convection, but it calculates so much diffusion that it actually appears as if it did convection, even though it never did it. Therefore, it is able to simulate a wider range of runoff diffusion effects. Disadvantage is that while the parameter C and N may be readily related to the basin's general topographic relief, considerable experience and a major rainfall raffle data is required for a proper estimation of these parameters. I submit that if you apply this method 20 times, the 25th or the 21st is going to be so easy like a piece of cake. You already know what you're going to do, but you got to feel it, feel the numbers. And that you can only acquire by doing it 20 times. 20 times. I just had a worker do some artificial turf in my backyard. That was done yesterday. And I finally had to ask him because he was doing like, it looked to be like a good job. And I said, excuse me, I said, how many of these projects have you done? And he looked at me like this kind of seriously, just more than 100. He was doing a good job. He knew what he was doing, right? One example. Conclusions. General dimensions based on the cascade of linear reservoirs formulated and calculated online. The GDUH is shown to be solely a function of the Courant number and the number of reservoirs. Since independent of the basin drainage area in the unit hydrograph duration, it is applicable on a global basis, anywhere in the world. Each DGUH is related only to the basin's prevailing runoff diffusion properties. Remember, I brought the issue of runoff diffusion back in '89 for the first time in my book. The word runoff existed, The word diffusion existed, much less usage, but it existed. We kind of put it together because we felt that that's exactly what engineers do. Calculate runoff, diffusion, and less relief and more diffusion. Indeed, the model two-parameter feature provides increased flexibility for simulating a wide range of diffusion effects. This is now 2009. I'm going to finish in here 1 minute. 2009. Of course, at that time, I could not know that in the year 2017, I was going to have a student that was going to do a master's degree. So I tell them, so and so, why don't you do this? Apply this stuff in practice. And he did, and it worked really great. It worked fantastic, as a matter of fact. Research on the estimation of CNN on the basis of basin relief, geomorphology, and related ecology should lead to an improved prediction of composite flow hydrographs, both for design and forecasting applications. And that's basically it. So we finished. We only have 3 minutes late, and we started 3 minutes late anyway, so we're fine. Okay, so with that, let me stop the sharing here. And my advice to you is, well, in order for you to do the homework, that is going to be a little bit intricate. You're going to have to reread a couple of papers, 2 or 3 papers, 2 papers in 1 section of the book, and make sure it's clear on your mind so that you can do it. Thank you very much. With that, I am going to shut it down here.